The history of gender roles and double standards surrounding white male masters and white women within Western societies, especially during the period of slavery, is complex and layered with stark inequalities. This context was heavily influenced by societal norms, economic considerations, and the legal framework of the time, establishing a rigid hierarchy of power and privilege that extended across gender lines in distinct ways. While white men held predominant authority and privilege, white women occupied a space defined by both proximity to power and an inherent subordination, bound by gender roles that were restrictive yet strategically wielded within certain social and economic constraints. The institution of slavery in the United States, beginning in the early 17th century, framed and deepened many of these dynamics, influencing how white men and women operated within society and further institutionalizing the societal double standards that permeated gender roles. While white men held the power to enslave, brutalize, and control, white women, though barred from holding direct ownership in most cases, often found ways to exert influence over enslaved individuals. Both roles were shaped by entrenched double standards that allowed white men wide-ranging autonomy, while white women were subject to restrictive social norms, albeit not without their own form of influence. White men, particularly those of the elite class, held immense economic, social, and political power. In the southern United States, where plantations were a primary economic driver, white men were often the heads of these estates, overseeing the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, of enslaved individuals. Legal structures facilitated this hierarchy, giving white male masters almost unchecked control over enslaved people, treating them as property and denying them any semblance of autonomy or personhood. The power they wielded extended beyond mere economic control. White male masters had the social, legal, and physical authority to dominate every aspect of an enslaved person's life, including intimate and personal relationships. This power dynamic positioned white male masters at the top of both the racial and gender hierarchy, creating a unique double standard where the actions of white male masters were often unchallenged, their abuses concealed or overlooked by society at large. The double standards allowed these white male masters unparalleled leeway in their private lives, often engaging in relationships with enslaved women either through coercion or force. Society largely ignored or rationalized these relationships, permitting white male masters to maintain control without scrutiny. Their relationships with enslaved women were neither bound by the societal standards that governed white women's behavior nor subject to the same moral judgments. These relationships underscored a powerful hypocrisy. While white male masters claimed to uphold family values and propriety, their actions directly contradicted those values. This double standard reinforced male dominance by showcasing a society that allowed white men extensive freedoms while holding white women and enslaved women to stricter moral codes. In the antebellum South, white women, though theoretically removed from the direct cruelty of slavery, participated in the system through the roles assigned to them as wives, mothers, and household managers. White women were encouraged to embody purity, piety, and submissiveness, aligning with the ideal of true womanhood. While they were not typically the primary slaveholders, their position allowed them to exert considerable control over domestic spaces, including enslaved individuals within the household. Many white women became enforcers of discipline and order, supervising the work and behavior of enslaved people in their homes. Although white women did not enjoy the same legal rights as white men, they wielded indirect power, benefiting from the economic advantages slavery afforded their families. A complex dynamic arose within these households. White women were sometimes complicit in, or even directly responsible for, the punishment and abuse of enslaved people. However, white women often harbored resentment toward enslaved women due to the relationships white male masters forced or pursued with them. While white men faced no repercussions for such relationships, white women were pressured to maintain a facade of harmony, often blaming enslaved women rather than their husbands for these unwanted relationships. This blame became part of the larger double standard, wherein enslaved women were viewed as temptresses, a view that painted them as morally inferior and dangerous, serving to further dehumanize them in the eyes of both white men and women. White women, restricted by the ideals of purity and fidelity, had few avenues to protest or retaliate against their husbands' actions, leaving them in a complex emotional position that often fueled animosity toward enslaved women rather than sympathy. The double standard was evident in how white women's behaviors and choices were scrutinized and constrained compared to their male counterparts. While white men could act outside of societal norms with little repercussion, white women were expected to embody them fully. Any deviation, even minor, could lead to social ostracism or damage to their family's reputation. Despite this, white women's proximity to power allowed them to benefit from, and sometimes enforce, the system of racial oppression that their husbands actively maintained. Their privileged position as white women placed them in a paradoxical role, subordinate in gender, yet dominant in race, creating a web of contradictions that allowed them to assert control in certain ways while remaining largely powerless in others. The double standards surrounding gender expectations were acutely visible in issues of sexual propriety and relationships. White male masters who pursued relationships with enslaved women encountered little social consequence, despite the hypocrisy inherent in these actions. White women, on the other hand, were expected to remain chaste and faithful, bound by the ideal of marital fidelity even when their husbands flagrantly disregarded this standard. Society stigmatized any form of romantic or sexual autonomy displayed by white women, reinforcing the notion that their worth lay in their purity and moral standing. White male masters, meanwhile, enjoyed almost limitless sexual freedom, insulated by a system that refrained from questioning their morality or integrity. In this context, enslaved women bore the brunt of these gender double standards. They had no means of refusing advances from white men, who exercised ownership over their bodies as they did with any other property. Enslaved women were left without recourse, as legal protections were non-existent and societal support was unlikely. For white women, this situation often fostered bitterness and jealousy, seeing enslaved women as rivals rather than fellow victims of male dominance. The forced relationships between white men and enslaved women also deepened the divide between white women and enslaved women, cementing the perception of enslaved women as inferior or morally suspect. This double standard regarding sexuality extended into every facet of gender expectations, further entrenching racial and gender hierarchies. These gender double standards were rooted in broader societal power structures that interwove race and gender to create a rigid hierarchy. White men were at the top of this structure, dominating both the legal and economic systems while enforcing their authority through violence and control. White women, while benefiting from their race, remained subordinate in the gender hierarchy, bound by restrictive societal expectations. Enslaved people, regardless of gender, occupied the lowest rung of this hierarchy, subjected to severe abuses and stripped of any semblance of rights or autonomy. The double standards upheld this system by creating separate codes of behavior that preserved white male authority and minimized challenges to their dominance. White women, often educated to value obedience and propriety, were conditioned to accept their roles, perpetuating a system where they had some power over enslaved individuals but little over their husbands. This division created a society in which white men retained control over both white women and enslaved people, justifying their actions through paternalistic rhetoric that portrayed white male masters as the ultimate guardians and providers. For white women, challenging this system was fraught with risk. The social, legal, and economic ramifications of questioning their husband's actions or publicly addressing the contradictions of the system were prohibitive. Many white women remained silent, choosing to focus their frustrations on enslaved women rather than confronting the root of their discontent. This silence and complicity sustained the institution of slavery, reinforcing the power dynamics that placed white men at the top and permitted the exploitation and mistreatment of enslaved people. The legacy of these double standards continued long after the abolition of slavery, as societal perceptions of gender roles and race carried into the postbellum period. The expectation that white men had a right to assert dominance, while white women were bound to uphold social propriety, evolved but persisted in subtler forms. White men continued to hold dominant positions in society, and white women were often positioned as symbols of moral virtue, whose behavior was carefully scrutinized. Meanwhile, the dehumanizing stereotypes and racial biases cultivated during slavery endured, influencing societal attitudes toward black men and women and perpetuating inequalities rooted in the same historical double standards. The dynamics between white male masters and white women offer a stark example of how power, privilege, and societal norms create complex systems of oppression. Double standards function not only to maintain white male dominance, but also to divide those who could have resisted this hierarchy, pitting white women against enslaved women and fostering resentments that serve the interests of the white patriarchal structure. The roles of white male masters and white women within slavery underscore the ways in which societal structures manipulate individuals and groups, reinforcing oppressive systems through intricate webs of privilege and subjugation. These historical dynamics continue to shape discussions on race, gender, and power, reminding us of the enduring impact of these deeply ingrained double standards on modern society.